What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over multi-input commands, or basically pressing two inputs at the same time to perform an action. So we have a lot of different things we can do with our input buffer system and just our input system in general. So I'd like to kind of go over it now so we can make everything clear for what everything is used for and what it can be done for. So first of all, let's take a look at this. So we can already, press a button to perform an attack. Simple, pretty easy. We can also have directional attacks, like if I'm moving and I do something, I go I maybe do a certain move. This is the same input that I'm using, like I'm using my medium attack here, but if I'm walking or holding a certain direction, then I use a different attack based on that. We can do commands by performing a correct sequence of inputs. So for example, fireball is, if I can do it correctly, I usually can't do it within the number of frames because I'm pretty slow, and honestly, I think it's a little bit harder on keyboard. I have to try and get this within 12 frames, and it is just not easy for me. You can see I can pull it off relatively frequently. However, we'll look into smoothing that out for controller and making sure it feels good on there. I think on keyboard, it's just a little bit difficult to perform within that amount of time. But I could also just be slow. Either way, that's a command. I can perform a sequence and then perform an action. Now, we also have charge attacks now, so I can charge a direction, such as holding back. And then, if I remember my input for this, I think it was special, so I don't have to charge for that long. But say I charge an attack, and then I go this way. Oops. There we go. And that's a charge attack. Now, if I do that input without charging, you see I do a different move, because this is my charge attack. It's not... If I don't charge it up, I can't do this action again. So if I just press it, then I do a different move. So there you go. So charge attacks, you have to hold, an input for however long to actually get it to work. Now, the last piece of the puzzle for the moment is that we want to press two buttons at the same time, or two inputs at the same time, to perform an action. So, like a lot of games have throws and grapples, we were just using the heavy button before to perform a throw. And so I was pressing one input, and that was like the throw button. Now, that's perfectly fine if you want to keep that. However, if you do want the ability to, throw or do special moves by pressing more than one button at a time, this is what we're going to be doing today. This is part 1 of 2. In the second episode, we will be expanding upon this and making sure everything works just the way we want it. But part 1 is all about getting this system to work. It's a little bit advanced, so I broke it up because I think this fits well into the input buffer, but it doesn't really complete it to the extent that we probably want for our final game. So, to do this, what we do is I have it mapped to light and heavy. Now, to date, our input buffer system has worked by following the correct sequence of inputs in a certain order. Well, when we're holding inputs, we have two inputs that we want to hold, right? Or two inputs that we want to press at the same time, really. Not hold necessarily, but press at the same time. You can't really set an order to that. There's a little bit of leniency. It's not, you have to press them on the same frame. At least most of the time, some games do that. But there's a little bit of leniency. You want to make sure you don't release the one input before pressing the other. That's the main thing. They have to be pressed at the same time and within a certain amount of frames of each other. So to do this, what we're going to do is basically we're going to check the input buffer both directions and allow it if the input is found within the command. So, watch this. If I perform light attack, I do this move. If I perform heavy, I don't have a heavy mapped right now because that was previously my throw, but you can see that nothing happens when I press heavy. Okay? And now what I can do is I can press these both at the same time, and I can perform my throw. And I can do it the other way. Priority isn't set up right now, so I do a light attack into a throw. Don't worry, we'll be covering this in part 2. If you've watched the series, you probably know how you can set priority order on these moves, and thus you'll be able to fix this no problem. However, we're going to cover it entirely in the next episode. But just understand that I can press either light and then heavy, which is when I do the punch first, but then still go into the grapple, or I can do heavy and then light, which is where I go directly into the grapple. Okay, and if you have a move bound to light and you have a move bound to heavy, then either way you're going to perform that corresponding move first, and then you'll go into your grapple. But the main thing is I cannot release either key first before pressing the other button. If I press one and then press the other, even if it's clearly within 12 frames, I will never go into that grapple state. Okay, that time I actually screwed up and had them both pressed. But now if we do it the other way, You can probably actually hear it because I have a mechanical keyboard. You can hear the release of the first key before I press the second. It'll still be within the 12 frames. But you can see that, see, like that time I ended up getting it, but you see what I mean, though. So you can't actually, you have to make sure they're both pressed at the same time. Even if you do it quickly enough, if you release one of the keys, then you don't perform the throw. But if you press them both, whoops, that was the wrong key. If you press them both, then you can see that it gets added. But it does have to be within the 12 frames. So say I press heavy, and then I press light. I do the light attack. This is intended, and this is how games normally do it. If you play a fighting game and you realize that you press one input for a multi-input command, such as a throw, and then you press the other later, it won't fire. It has to be within a certain amount of frames. Same with the light. If I press this first, I do this. If I press the heavy, I won't do it until I've released it. See that? So if I do it, I have to press them both again. So press, and then I have to press them both again. If I just do it and then press it, I don't use it. Do it, press it, don't use it. But if I do it and then I use it, then you can see I'm using it. Okay. So anyway, that's a long explanation, but I'm just trying to show you everything the input buffer can do. We want to make sure everything still works by the time we're done with this. We don't want to introduce any bugs. There will be a part 2 to clean up some of the things that aren't quite done with the multi-button inputs yet, just because, well, we'll get into that in a second. But just know everything else of your input buffer should still be working. All right. Now, before we get started, we are on episode 99, believe it or not. 99 of the Fighting Game Tutorial series. We've done a lot so far. We have a lot more to go. We're nowhere near done, but, you know, we're quite a few episodes in here. So if you'd like to get caught up, I'll leave the playlist in the top right corner right here. This is every episode for the Fighting Game Tutorial series. It shows everything I've done to get to this point. Otherwise, I'll show you the initial episode to the input buffer system right here if you want to get caught up to all the things we've done for our actual input buffering. All right. So, like I said, today is going to be a little bit complicated. We're only going to add one minor hack to get this to work, and the hack will be removed next episode. So, we're going to be, you know, it's going to be pretty advanced for right now because we're doing it what I feel is the correct way, basically the way I imagine it working in actual fighting games. We're going to add it to our input buffer. We're not going to try and trick the system by, like, you know, oh, if I'm holding this button and this button gets pressed, do this. We don't want it to be hard-coded because I'm trying to give you full freedom over you choosing what moves are held or multi-button and charged and all these other things, and getting them all to work together can be a little bit complicated. So there's one thing that we do need that I have already covered in a previous episode, but I want to make sure you have it because we're going to use it today. We hadn't actually used it yet. I added it in preparation, but we never used it. So in our input status enum, we had none. Basically, it's not being pressed. The press for saying when we first press an input, release when we release the input, and then I had hold, which we never did anything with. And we had charge attacks, and we didn't use hold, so some people were probably like, what is going on here? So for hold for me, it's basically meaning that maybe I pressed it, maybe I released it. It doesn't really matter. What's important now is that this has to be used with another input. So hold is essentially the middle ground, just saying I have to use this with another input or it's not valid. If you want to come up with a better name or a different name or a better name that suits what you're going for, feel free to change that. But that's what I intended hold to be, and that's what we're going to be using today. So again, you probably already have this in here if you've been following the series, but just something I wanted to make note of. Now, this is a little something for the next episode. You may have seen that because I loaded into this file there. You don't have to worry about it for now. It's commented out because I'm not using it in today's episode, but we're going to use it next time. So feel free to hypothesize if you'd like. And in the header file, we don't have to change too much, actually. We don't have to add any variables or change any currently existing functions other than the one where we check for inputs that we're going to put into our input buffer and then perform commands based on them. And we have to make one other function. So our check input buffer for command using type is fine in the header file. We're going to be editing it in the CPP, but it's fine. Under that, I put a new function. Bool is input in multi-input command. It takes an F command in and an E input type in. Now, what this is going to be used for is this is going to determine if this command that we are currently searching is a multi-input command. Remember that term? I'm really just saying, does this command require 2 buttons to be pressed at the same time? Or 2 or more buttons or inputs, let's say, because it could be more than that. So it's really, I mean, you could tag like the command as a multi-input command, but really the reason this is important is I can pass in an input and see if that input is currently being pressed or has been pressed and has not been released. And if the command we're currently searching in the check input buffer for command using type function is a command that has hold inputs. So basically, if the command we're looking at is a command that requires 2 or more inputs to be pressed at the same time, and if we are pressing that one of those inputs, one or more of those inputs currently, then we're doing things right. Because remember, we don't want to check these commands in sequence anymore. Not the ones that we want multiple inputs to be pressed at the same time on. Because if you check them in a sequence and you put in heavy and light as your attacks, you have to press heavy then light. If you want to just, make it really fluid and not so specific, then by having this function we're going to put in here, you can either press light then heavy or heavy then light, and it will fire either way, and that's what we want. So go into your fighter template character.cpp, and we can scroll down. Really, you can go all the way down to check input buffer for command using type. There is technically one thing we're going to add in functions above, but don't worry about that for now. I'll get to that when it's relevant later in the episode. So we're going to start in this function, like I said, and I'll go over it again in full because every time we go over this, it's a pretty advanced function at this point, probably the most difficult function we've written to date. And so I want to kind of show everything so you're familiar with what's going on here. Okay, so let's walk through this. So this function takes in an E input status, and it basically determines this function gets called whenever we press an input or release an input. So what we do in here is we have a correct sequence counter, or basically the number of correct inputs we've gotten in a row to perform a command. For, basic attacks, it's a 1 input thing. So once you press the input, this function basically succeeds right away. However, it gets more complicated as you add certain things in there. Like our fireball is backward, forward, light, punch. If we were to try and do that without this sort of function, then how would you know if other inputs were pressed in between? Like, you wouldn't want to be able to perform fireball by pressing backward, forward, medium, heavy, light. Like, that should be a different move, or, it shouldn't exactly fire just because you spammed buttons. It has to be the actual sequence that we want it to be. So for this, we set the correct sequence counter to 0 by default. Then we loop through all the commands that our character has. As a reminder, our characters, they have, and if you click on the class defaults and then your character's BP, character BP is, excuse me, then we have this character commands array, and it has all the inputs, all the commands, and all the attacks and moves they can do. Usually, a move looks like this. Has an input type, like light attack, and what I have to do to perform it, such as a press. Then it also has a number of charge frames if it is a charge attack, so we know how long we have to charge it for. And then the max frames between inputs, so it doesn't matter for a 1 input command, but if you go to something like Fireball where it's backward, forward, light, I have 30 frames to put these in. I made it 30 so that I could do it more easily on keyboard, because when I had it at 12, I would fail like every other time, and I don't think that you probably wanted to see that every single time, so I made it 30, but you can keep it at 12. That doesn't really matter. It was working fine as was. I just wanted to let you know. All right, but something we haven't done before is try to use 2 inputs at the same time to perform a command. So to do this, we can add a new command to our character, and you can see I have light attack, press, heavy attack, press for these 2 commands for heavy attack and light attack. But now I've added a new command. Press plus right here in character commands if you want to add it. And I've added it and called it backward throw, because that's what this move is. And it is light attack, hold, 0 charge frames. Heavy attack, hold, 0 charge frames. And again, I gave it 30 between inputs just for today's demonstration. We'll probably make it less than that. You can really make it like, honestly, 3 or 4. It's a little bit easier to press 2 inputs at or on the same frame than it is to perform a sequence when you have to be moving around, not perform them at the same time. So you can make this one a little bit more strict and it should be perfectly fine. All right, so just make sure that you add inputs. These are the inputs that you want to press at the same time, light and heavy. And make sure their input status is hold, because we're going to use that to determine if it's one of these attacks and kind of how to treat things differently. So go back into the code. We're going to loop through all of our commands, and we're going to set the correct sequence counter to the end of this command, because we're going to step through it backward, since most of our commands are sequential. So we want to see and make sure that we have the last element, the last input in the command, and if we do, then step back and see if we press the other corresponding inputs. This is all stuff you've seen before if you're familiar with the series. So we loop through the frame that we're currently on. The frame basically determines how many frames back we should check. So if we can perform this action, if we can only wait 12 frames in between, then we are only going to check the last 12 frames worth of inputs. Then we do a little bit of logic to determine what frame we're currently checking. And then we grab the type, status, and the number of charge frames of our current input that the user put in so that we can compare it against the things in our command buffer to see if it fits all the requirements. This is all stuff that has not changed. Okay, then we go and see, basically our goal is to get correct sequence counter to -1, because -1 is essentially saying, okay, you've met your goal, you've done all the inputs correctly, it is time to perform that command. And then here is where things start to change. And this is pretty big, so forgive me, I'm going to have to scroll a bit here. But I'm going to go over this if statement, and I'll tell you what we had and what changed. So basically, this entire if statement, if I read it in full, we have to make sure that the type that the user pressed for this input is equal to the type that of the input we're currently checking from the command. Or we have to see if this is a multi-input command and the user is currently pressing the correct input for one of those multi-inputs. So for example, if my attack is light and heavy, am I currently going over a light or heavy in my input buffer? And is this command one that actually requires both inputs or more inputs to be held or pressed at the same time? And the status is not equal to release. This function gets called, like I said, when we press or release an input. In the case of holding inputs or pressing multiple inputs at the same time, remember I said we don't want to be able to release one of them and still perform the command. We do not think of multi-input commands as sequence here. They are not in a sequence. They have to be pressed together. If one is released, it breaks the command. That's the first thing here. So if the types match, we're pressing the right input that the command expects, or it's a multi-input command and we're pressing one of the inputs that the command expects, and this was not triggered from a release. We did not release this input. We pressed it. Because if we release it, remember, it throws it off. And status is equal to the correct status of the input we're checking from the command. Status is press, held, or released. Remember, type is the actual input, like light attack, forward, down, however you want to say it. Basically, this is the actual input. This is the state of the input, like press, release, hold, and this is the number of charge frames. So we have to make sure we're in the right status. Or, we're doing it again, or the status is equal to press. Do this again. Or the status is equal to press, and the input status of the command we're checking is equal to hold. This is because we don't ever set anything in our input buffer to actually be hold. Hold is only used on the command right now. And so it's okay if it's okay to be a press and for the status to not match, for our status from the input buffer not match the status of the command, because the command is a hold, but ours is only going to be a press. It's okay for them not to match up as long as it's this specific combination, press and hold. If you had release here, this would not work. We don't want to perform any hold inputs on a release. Okay, and we also don't want it to be none, because it can be none if a default value gets passed into here. So it has to specifically be press to hold. And charge frames is greater than the required charge frames for this input. Charge frames has not changed, so we're not really worried about that. But these top two lines, they both got an additional OR statement. Before today's episode, you would have this line right here, this line right here, and this line right here. So these, I'll show you. This OR right here was added today. And this OR was added in this episode. So you can go ahead and add those two things. It's okay if it doesn't make too much sense yet. We're going to go over, more logic, of course, in this function that should help clear it up a bit. Okay. And then assuming that we actually get through this convoluted if statement, that means that we've gotten a correct input for the command that we're currently on, so we can decrement from the correct sequence counter. Basically, we can say, yes, this input is correct. We want to check the next one in the sequence to see if we performed it correctly. Then we had this else if, which basically checked and makes sure the type wasn't equal to none and the status wasn't equal to release. If it's not equal to these two, that means that we only got here because one of these conditions failed. If the condition failed, the most likely reason is that we had released an input. We had pressed an input that was the wrong input that this command expected. So if we are looking at the fireball command, which again is back, forward, light punch, and we did back, forward, heavy. Well, we have to fail out of this if we're on the fireball command. That is not the correct input. This will not help us actually perform the fireball. So we have to reset the correct sequence counter to the default value, which you remember we set it up here above. Okay, then I've added another else if because there's another state where we could fall out and not perform a command. It has to do with our new commands that we can do where we have to press multiple inputs at the same time. So else if is input in multi-input command, current command and type, just like we did before, and status is equal to release. So what this means is if we determined that this is a command that requires 2 or more inputs to be pressed simultaneously, and the status of the input we're giving it is a release, then we know we're wrong. As I did up above, where we checked against release, in fact, it's pretty much the same as this, with one minor difference. So we do this OR statement where we were saying, if it is this correct type of command and we're not releasing it, then we're good to go. It's a correct input. This is the alternative. This is the opposite, actually. This is saying, yeah, this is a multi-input command, but we're releasing the input. That's a wrong action. We shouldn't be releasing if we're expecting to press them both at the same time. Thus, we want to reset the correct sequence counter. We screwed up. Or we're trying to perform a different attack, but we definitely don't want to perform the backward throw if we did this. Then, lastly, if the correct sequence counter is equal -1 and input status is not equal to release. Now, you can leave this alone. This is how it was in the past. Just know when we get into negative edge and things like this will change a little bit, but don't worry about it for now. This basically just determines that we don't want to perform this command again on a release. We only want to perform it on a press. But some characters or actions may actually be different than that. And that's the entire function. It is a very complicated function, I know. But this is, it's a very complicated system. Okay. Now, the other thing we want to do is write our is input in multi-input command. And so what this does, it's pretty simple. It takes in an F command and an E input type, as I mentioned earlier. And we're going to basically just loop through this. We're going to loop through all the inputs in this command. Input types relate to the actual inputs I have to press. So once again, for fireball, this would be backward, forward, light punch. Now, if we do a for each loop, this is how a for each loop is done in C++. And so we do auto input, basically makes a copy of this right here, and it's going to loop through all indices in there. So it's going to go backward, forward, and light. Now, we made it a Boolean, remember? So giving it a type, if it's not void, means it has to return a value that is of that type, either true or false, since it's a Boolean. And we need to do this because we need to know if the input we are currently performing and the command we're currently looking at is a command that requires multiple inputs to be pressed at the same time. If it's not, this logic is not applicable. We have to do a lot of commands in sequence. If it's fireball, we have to do backward, forward, light punch. We can't press backward, forward, light punch all at the same time. I mean, if you want it to be that way, that's perfectly fine. But right now, we don't want it to be that way. After the next episode, actually, you'll be able to have more freedom with that if you would like that, by the way. However, in this case, and in a lot of cases, you don't want those sort of moves to be performed at the same time. You'll want it to be backward, forward, and then light punch. 3 separate actions. Now, that's what this is doing. You know, this is saying, is this really a command where they can be pressed at the same time? And so if it's true, then yes, that's the case. And the user is currently pressing an input that actually fits within there. So what do I mean by this? We're looping through our inputs that are in the command. Let's do backward throw. So backward throw is light and heavy. If we press those together, we're supposed to perform our throw. So let's go through this logic. If the input were on, let's say light. We'll start with the light. If light is equal to our pressed input, remember we pass it in above from the type, and the type gets determined by the current frame we're checking and the actual type that the user had pressed. So like light punch or forward, whatever. We pass it in, and we say, okay, this is light punch. If this is true that it's light punch, then it says, okay, this input is light punch. So sure, you're pressing one of the inputs that are required for this command. But then it has to check and make sure that the input status on the command is equal to hold. It is. So we'll say, okay, this is a valid input for you to be pressing, and we're going to return true. This is a multi-input command, and the input that you are pressing is in that command. Is input in multi-input command. That's where the name comes from. Okay? Otherwise, it's going to go through and loop through all these. If it doesn't ever meet these conditions, then it's going to return false, and it's going to fail that part of the if statement. Now, this is called at an OR, so if this succeeds, it doesn't matter if this other one succeeds, so it doesn't ruin our other logic. But if this fails, it could still succeed by doing this. Okay? Otherwise, let's say it matches up, okay? So if it's the light punch, like I said, and the command itself, the backward throw, is set to be a hold, then it returns true. Yes, the input you've pressed is in a multi-input command. Then it returns true. If it returns true, and these other conditions are true, then this whole if statement is going to return true, which is going to decrement the correct sequence counter, which is going to get it closer to -1. And then say my next input that I press in here is a heavy attack. After I did light, we're going to pass heavy in. It's going to say, okay, are any of the inputs in here equal to heavy, or the pressed input, which will be heavy. And when this matches up and says they are, it determines if the heavy from the command is also a hold right here. And if it is, then we return true again. It's going to return true again, which is going to decrement the correct sequence counter, which would set it to be -1. And once it's -1, then that means we perform the action. So we go down to this if statement, and it is equal to -1, and the status is not equal to release because it triggered on a press. And then backward throw gets added to the move buffer. Simple, right? And I'm joking. I know it could be quite complicated. Even looking at it and trying to figure it all out and think about it is pretty hard. Usually I would do this on a whiteboard or like a little notepad or something. I think I use paint more often than anything. I'm going to actually do that more next episode because we're not quite done. Like I said, this is part 1 of 2. So I'll go over the whole thing with the finalized changes for the system, for the multi-input commands in part 2. And then we'll bring up some good old paint. But for now, it's not the end of the world if you don't understand, honestly. I don't ever like skipping things, and then you guys aren't familiar with what's going on, and then you get lost. However, this is quite complicated, and it's going to get more complicated, so I'd rather kind of introduce you to it now. You see how it works, and you can get it working. And then when we put in our finalized changes, we go over it and go fully in depth, even more so, and hopefully it'll make sense. Okay? All right, so at that point, if you launch it, you'll be good to go, and you'll see that it doesn't work at all. And why doesn't it work? Well, it doesn't actually work because Unreal's input system with their input actions and their input axes is actually a little bit strange. Or not necessarily strange, but it might not work how you expect. It didn't work how I expected, and it actually threw me off when I first did this. Because I could see that the logic was working as I wanted, but I wasn't getting the result I wanted. So let's think about what could be going on here. Now, when we perform an action, I'm going to actually demonstrate this one for you. Let's go into my base character BP so I can show you something. All right. Now, we have the key display name. When we press, we have this input action called add to input buffer P1. Let's start there. And if we go into it, and you probably have this and you're probably familiar with it, but when you go into it, these get automatically generated. We set up a function to grab all the inputs that player 1 or player 2 could press. Player 2 only really matters for keyboard mode, so don't worry about that too much for now. The important one is add to input buffer P1, because either any player with a controller can use this one, or player 1 on the keyboard can use this one. And so it gets populated with all the inputs that player 1 could potentially use. Same with player 2. It actually has a few additional ones that I ended up adding for testing purposes. Nothing you need to worry about, like I said. Anyway, this has all the inputs that player 1, or again, any player on a controller could press. So you think, oh, I want to press light, which is G in my case, and heavy, which is Z in my case. This should be easy. It should pick up on both of those, right? They're both in the input action. Well, okay. So this is supposed to print every time we press or release a button. Let's print out this value. I'm just going to steal it from here, okay? You don't have to do this. This is just for demonstration. So if I press, I'll connect it back up so everything's still working. But if I press any input in that input action, which should be all the actions that player 1 or player 2 has access to, then it should print out the name of the key. That's what I'm doing here. Ignore how ugly it is. We're getting rid of it anyway. But let's see what happens when we actually do this. So we go into our game here. And I can print out a bunch of stuff, right? You can see it printing in the top left. All right, so let's try and press 2 of these inputs at the same time. That's weird. Why is nothing printing? And you can see I'm performing an action. If you were to do this, you wouldn't be performing it. I'll press a different key, so it's not as confusing. But okay, see, that's weird. I'm pressing E and I'm doing this, but what's funny? I'm also pressing G. Why is it only printing E when I'm pressing them both at the same time? Sometimes you see a G slips in. Okay. So input actions and input axes in Unreal will only fire for the first input that is pressed to activate them. So if you press 2 inputs at the same time, or not even at the same time necessarily, if you're holding, like say I'm holding G, I'm holding my light, and I use my heavy instead, it actually will not let me use, it won't fire this and use the light again. And so it becomes a little bit weird because you can't really press 2 inputs of the same and still expect to 2 inputs of the same input action and still expect to use them. So when I look at this, if I do G, and then E, I can't do E because I am still holding G. Isn't that weird? Isn't that broken? Yeah, that's not working as it should be. It's not really a fault on our end. I honestly mean that. It's more an issue on the input action side. However, since we do have this add to input buffer P1 and it encompasses all our keys, that causes a problem for us. It's okay, though. We're going to fix it, and we're going to fix it in part 2. I actually have a very good method to do so, and it's not too hard, actually, with what we have implemented already. However, I'm not covering it today because it is going to be quite a lot of changes that we have to include. It's not going to change our actual input buffer system, don't worry. But instead of having this event call everything, we're going to go back to our system of having basically our individual events call this action. And I won't get too much into it now, but just know it is under control. I already have the solution, and I know what route we're going. But just understand that change is coming, and that's why the inputs feel a little bit off. If you've ever noticed some, non-responsive or I guess unresponsive inputs in your game, that could be why. I actually noticed it quite a bit back, and I didn't know why, and then I learned after some testing why this is actually happening. And it's a lot of the reason that our game does not feel as nice as it could, because the game should not require you to release certain inputs and things before performing another. Say, for example, I'm holding my light attack, and let's go back to Killer Instinct because I'm used to it. Well, I shouldn't have to release the one input first to perform the other. Even if by human error, I go to move my finger, and I'm still on the X button when I press the Y button on Xbox. Sorry, I had to think about what button it was. If I'm on the X button and I move my thumb and I press the Y button before I fully release the X button, I should still perform the next attack. It would feel pretty awkward if I didn't. And that's the situation we're in. That's why we have to fix it. That's coming in part 2. Like I said, don't worry about it for now. And I'm going to pump part 2 very soon after this. So you should see it if you wait. Just look for part 2 of multi-input commands, and that'll be covered in there. But we're not worried about that for now. We're still going to make sure that our actual multi-input command works in this episode so you can use it. Just know that's why there's some awkwardness sometimes. Okay, and hopefully I did a good job of explaining, and you kind of understand why it's also not working. It took me quite a bit to understand why I wasn't picking up that input. So here's where we're going to add the hack, but I promise it's a very minor hack, and it will be getting rid of it. We'll be doing it fully proper in the next episode. But this will be able to make us wrap up our episode and allow you to use these attacks and start planning them out. The only thing we'll do is, again, we'll add the logic in the next episode. But you can still set up any attacks you want with it now, and they will transfer. You won't have to reset them up or anything. So, if you go to your start attack 1, 2, 3, and 4, we don't really use these anymore. These were initially what we used before we used our input buffer, but there is a way to get around this. And so this is basically the first level of the fix for next episode, just dumbed down and, again, a little bit of a hack. So if you can perform different input actions, of course, at the same time. You just can't perform the same input action by pressing multiple keys within it. So by having an input action with every key in it, it causes the issue. Well, that means I can still perform this action by adding it to the input buffer just by manually adding it when I press the light attack button or the heavy attack button. Okay, so hopefully you start to see what we're going to be doing in the next episode. Instead of doing all this manual stuff that we're making, we're still going to use our add input to input buffer and that entire system, but we're not going to call it off of one input action. We're going to make an event we can call to trigger the logic so that no matter what input we press, it triggers. Even if we want to have it added to the input buffer and all that good stuff, we need to make sure that each input is tracked no matter what. Okay, we want it to be tracked. Even if we can't do anything with it at the moment, we need it to be tracked. Okay? So, let's look at this. This is our light attack. This is what I had in here before, and I also had this in this if statement, but I removed it as well. I mean, when I was working on the solution for part 2, I also thought of this, and I was like, oh, we don't really want it that way. So, generally, when you're using your attacks and your input buffer, these just... Like, say you're in practice mode here. I actually went to versus. Say we're in practice mode. Okay, we have our hurt boxes and all. Well, you see that my inputs are printing to my corresponding input buffer. Okay, good. Well, when I press an input, it displays to the screen. Good. Well, before, if I was doing this, or like some of this, not all the inputs would press. Because I was only doing it, I was only adding it to the input buffer, or excuse me, adding it to the icon to the screen. If the player could attack, the state was not equal to blocking, and the combo state was equal to none. That's kind of stupid. The whole thing is that you can see what the player is pressing. That's the whole point of it. So take it out of that if statement. Just put it up above. You can do this for all 4 attacks, or however many attacks you have. You can also do it for other things like the exceptional attacks and the jumps and the movement. I didn't do all that yet, but really, just it's a little thing, just something I thought I'd add. Just feel free to take them out. No reason to kind of block this logic from happening. It's just adding it to the input stack on the screen. It's more for debugging and for practice mode. It's not going to affect anything, but I feel like it should be that way. It was annoying me that it wasn't. So, but otherwise, I haven't changed anything about this function. All I did was add this guy. And so there's a little bit of foreshadowing for part 2. What we do is we make a new input info, and we automatically set the types based off of what function is being called. So if this is start attack 1, this is bound to right here. Attack 1 P1 is bound to start attack 1. So when I press my light attack, that's what attack 1 P1 is. Then I do start attack 1. Very simple. And so if we scroll back down here, we know this is a light attack. So we do light attack and we do press. And then we grab the cur tick, which is something we've set up in the series. In our tick function, you can check out the input buffering episode. I can iCard it right here if you want to catch up on that. But so we know exactly what frame it was added. And then we add it to our input buffer. And it does the same logic. It still gets added to our input buffer, and it still does the logic that we want. Without doing much of a hack at all, we just basically pass this in manually. Okay, so you can do this for all your attacks now if you want, 1, 2, 3, and 4. But notice, we're going to remove this in the next episode. And we're flat out just going to write an event that we can call. That way we can just call add to input buffer, and we don't have that one input action that does it all. So, you know, you don't have to do more than's needed now. If you want, feel free to add it to start attack 1, 2, and 3. You can add it to move right. You can add it to jump. You can add it everywhere if you'd like. But I'm going to make it better in the next episode. Anyway, long story short, doing this means that all of our inputs, regardless if they are, if I press light and heavy now they both get added to the input buffer. Makes little difference because these are different input actions and they can both receive it. Okay, so that'll solve your problem. That'll let you do multi-button and multi-input attacks and commands. There is one other thing you should be aware about. I guess. So if we go to our add input to input buffer function. This right here. So this is all good. Don't worry. It's not changing. It's golden how it is. But what this does right here is this takes the input that comes in and it sets it in the circular input buffer and then says we've captured input this frame. If you press 2 inputs on the exact same frame, let alone all the input action stuff we just talked about. Say you press 2 inputs on the same frame and this function gets called both times. Okay, so I press light and I press heavy like we've been doing this whole episode. When I do that, this function will get called from the blueprint. Start tracking charge time. Here we go. This function will get called from the blueprint, add input to input buffer. And it also gets called from the code in these new places that I just hacked together for now. Right here, add input to input buffer. And when we fix our issue in the next time, then this is still going to get called every input we press. It's going to get called from multiple places, okay? Well, if you press 2 on the same frame, how are we going to check in the circular buffer which input we should track? Our circular input buffer only actually keeps one element right now. One F input info. And so 2 inputs can't really be pressed on the same frame right now. They can, but even if we did this correctly, we used our Boolean correctly, one's going to get overwritten. So what that means is we need to set up an array It'll be a small array, probably not all your keys, but probably like eight inputs or, a bit worth, whatever you want to do, however you want to set it up. Basically, we want to be able to track multiple inputs that are pressed on the same frame. Remember when I said this was a little bit of a spoiler for next episode right here? F input info array. Well, that's what it's going to be used for. So you'll be able to press, however many inputs on the same frame, and we'll be able to keep track of them all. But it does mean we have to change a little bit of how we loop through these things. It'll be pretty much the same. We just have to keep track of the different indices on the input in the circular input buffer itself. It's the best way to say it. So those are the two issues currently. You won't be able to press two inputs from the same input action. And that's not a fault of ours. That is how Unreal is set up. So we'll be fixing our system to support that and remove the awkwardness in part 2. And we will also be fixing it so that multiple inputs can be added to the same frame and pressed on the same frame and still tracked and checked properly for our input buffer. We'll be covering both of those in part 2 of multi-input commands. And once we've done that, guys, I honestly believe that our system will be good enough that, yes, sure, we still need to, potentially make it better or smoother. But at that point, it should fully function as intended as a real input buffer system in a game would. It's been a long journey with the input buffer. And so I know you're probably tired of it by now, but it is just so darn important with all the things we can actually do with it. And so now we can actually use our multi-button presses, and it feels pretty good. So anyway, guys, that's all I got for you today. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please subscribe. It helps myself out and the channel more than anything else you can do. And I want to give a huge shout out to the Patreon membership and YouTube membership subscribers. Thank you guys so much for helping me continue this series and just giving me support. I really, really appreciate it. It means so much to me that you care that much about it, and I'm glad you're excited to see it. Lastly, guys, if you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I know this episode was pretty tough. There was a lot going on. It took me quite a bit of time to actually figure out how I wanted to do it anyway, so I don't blame you. It took me a lot of effort to get this working with everything else we have in our input buffer. So don't worry about that at all. I'd be happy to help out. And lastly, guys, actually, there's nothing else for me to say. So I'm just going to wrap up here. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.